Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Daily Maverick webinar virtual book launch. It's the launch of a wonderful book by Carl Kemp. It's his first book entitled Promised Land, Exploring South Africa's Land Conflict. And Carl, we are very happy to have you with us this afternoon, and we look forward to a very interesting and lively discussion on what is a fraught topic. My name is Judith February, and I will be facilitating this webinar conversation. Firstly, just on structure, Carl and I will be having a conversation, and then please feel free, if you have questions, to put those questions in the chat. And I see that there are a number of you who've already joined us from Pretoria, Port Elizabeth, McGregor even, and Durban. So welcome to all of you. So, Carl, firstly, again, thank you for joining us. I must say I had a wry smile when I saw that it was called Promised Land, because your book has a similar title to Barack Obama's. So I'm not sure. Barack Obama's first week has sold 887,000 copies. So I'm not sure whether you're expecting the same level of sales.
Well, I'm not entirely sure, Judith, but let me assure you, I have written to Mr. Obama to inform him of my concerns, and I hope you'll receive them in due course and respond, because this is very unfortunate for both of us.
I think it's a pity that he's not on this webinar. Anyway, Carl, enough of that. We've got you, so that's all right. So, Carl, a very interesting and beautifully written book, I must say. Why did you decide on this book? What was it that drove you to write about this rather fraught topic at also a very fraught time in South Africa's political history?
I have to say, Judith, it was kind of a coming together of a lot of circumstances and my thinking about certain things in the socio-political makeup of the country. But in all honesty, it was actually started as a book about farm murders and the farm murder phenomenon. Penguin, the publisher, really liked my background in crime pattern analysis. I worked briefly at the International Criminal Court, and they saw in me a kind of Afrikaner who could speak objectively about this kind of thing, and it's also a really sensitive topic. But it took less than a month of preliminary research and trying to structure the chapters around this book that it became very clear that land is kind of what gives the farm murder phenomenon its meaning. And that just snowballed into more and more research on what land means, why it's so important to South Africans, why it's become such a hotly debated topic. And eventually I said to the publisher, listen, there's only one way this book is going to work, and that's if we flip it and make it about the land conflict with farm murders as a component of that. But the overarching story is about land. And they were happy with that. And we set up some preliminary chapters, and the end product is the book we have.
And so just for those of you who've joined, and Carl, you talked a little bit about where you've been, but this, as I said, is your first book, but you have a master's in law, in public international law from the University of Amsterdam, no less, and you are a journalist, but you've also worked at the International Criminal Court, and you've been a legal researcher for an NGO grappling with the Syrian civil war. So you've had extensive experience in all manner of things, in writing and in analysing. So I suspect that part of that was very helpful when you were writing a book like this, and particularly when you were starting this journey across South Africa. So tell us a little bit about how your background helped you to write this book, but also about your journey across the country in 2019. I mean, you go from farm to township to homelands. You've really have seen the heart of the country.
You know, Judith, I wouldn't say necessarily that I picked up a lot of skills that helped me in writing this book. And on a practical level, actually, the people I've met over the years working as a journalist were incredibly useful in pointing me to sources and fixers. For example, I have one fixer in Soweto that I've known for 6 years now, and he is just amazing. So that's maybe a practical example. In terms of how it shaped the approach to the book, I think writing for legal publications is a very different style than writing for a target audience that you want them to enjoy the book rather than fall asleep while reading it. So I had to say, I actually had to tone back my my legal writing style a bit and get into this mindset of writing for popular entertainment. But yeah, so that answers the first part of your question. The second part about traveling across the country, yeah, it was hectic. It was quite hectic. And I mean, I was operating on a shoestring budget purely because, well, the publishing industry isn't what it used to be. Writers don't necessarily get huge advances to go ahead and do their thing. So I was staying on people's couches and, keeping an ear open for friends who could give me discount deals on guest houses and so on. And then, yeah, I'd make a little base wherever I went, and I'd start asking around. I'd start phoning up ex-colleagues who work for newspapers and other media outlets now, and I'd call up the fixers in the area and I'd say, listen, what's happening here with land? Are there land invasions around here? Are you struggling with rural security? Are there a lot of incidents of violence out here? And then I'd go and speak to the people who they pointed me towards, and the book kind of grew organically from there. So it was very much the trip that informed the backbone and the narrative of the entire book.
And so in your book, you talk about, and I want to go through, so every chapter, what I found fascinating about the book is that it does deal with, I mean, you talk about obviously the land issue now, expropriation without compensation and so on, but really it is about a sense and a concept of home and place, really. And that's, to me, that link with the land, that to me was actually part of the most fascinating part of the book, and the telling of stories, because I think a lot of the time, we hear about land in abstract, but not how it informs people's sense of belonging, of citizenship, and of place. So what was the most surprising thing with regard to that sense of place that you picked up on your trip, and perhaps on which trip was that you came across something that really blew you away and surprised you?
With a lot of options, I'm going to have to go for...
You can choose two.
Well, the most surprising thing actually was just how little I knew personally about South African history. You think you have a kind of grasp on it, more or less broad strokes what happened. You learned about it in school, but there's a lot to get through. There's been a lot of history since Van Riebeeck landed at Table Bay, and obviously before that as well. And I was very surprised at how distinct the phases are since the arrival of Van Riebeeck, in terms of how the Cape Colony basically has its own 2-century-long history before the trackers even left, before the gold reef boom, before the Anglo-Boer War, before then Union, before then apartheid. I mean, all of these things are so distinct and they have so many moving parts inside of them. But sorry, to get back to your question of one example,
no, that's
I think I think the best example would be what happened between the Mariko Boers in what is today Northwest Province and the various Tswana tribes that were living there around the time the Boers arrived, because that was very much an ivory and a hunting kind of hotspot. And you had these various Tswana groups who were all kind of vying for supremacy, and also for who could have control over the trade routes and the access routes and so on. And it's fascinating to read about the different kind of relationship, for example, that the Tswana groups had with one group of Mariko Boers, who, for example, wanted to avoid conflict at all costs because the ivory trade was too lucrative to risk that. And then you had another group of Boers who would have been based at Potch, who were agitating for dominion and conquest of the territory. And alongside that, you had the English coming up from the Cape Colony. You had the Griquas, that's a completely other story, who also wanted to conquer that territory and control the ivory trade. And I mean, just the stories that arise from that period are mind-boggling to see how South African groups interacted. And the other most important thing about this is how completely different those interactions were to, for example, what happened between the British and the Xhosa on the borders of what is now the Eastern Cape. Or for that matter, the interactions between the Boers under Piet Retief when they fought against the Zulu and were bounced back off the Blood River and they had to move up into what is now Gauteng. Just how different all of these interactions were. And I think it's just impossible to reduce the kind of what happened to, the arrival of settlers and this huge dispossession of indigenous peoples and what we have today. That being said, that kind of is the situation we're faced with. The inequalities in the country are very obvious. So I suppose that then creates the question, what's the point in dissecting all of this history if the end result is the same? I don't have an answer for that one. That might be a bit of a question for a few drinks at the bar.
Yes, that's actually fascinating because, and isn't some of what we're hearing in modern parlance in South Africa about the issue of land? I mean, there's a lot of populism around it, and what the populism does is it tries to reduce very complex concepts into something very simple and for people to digest and understand. And what I hear you saying is that the complexity of South Africa doesn't lend itself to that reductionist thinking, obviously. And that creates a problem when you're trying to make policy and when you're doing politics in a way.
Absolutely. And you also, for example, we tend to think of government as being kind of isolated and removed from what's happening on a more grassroots level. But I think you can definitely see that the ANC's policy on land in recent years has been led by this push from behind by the EFF and more radical groups. So it certainly has an effect on policymaking in South Africa. And it definitely, we end up with policy that's not necessarily tailored to actually improve things where they should be improved or can be improved, logistically speaking, practically speaking.
Yes.
I'm absolutely agreement with you. That is, and sorry, I have to mention here that just before we move on to the next topic, one person who has made this point about the complexity of history informing our modern policy making, Cheryl Walker at the University of Stellenbosch. Her research informed a large part of my thinking on this. So anyone who's more interested in that should just check out Cheryl Walker. She has written it very concisely and accessibly.
Yes. And then, so just moving on, I mean, in your preface, you say the players are, in this land issue, the players are corrupt officials, racist farmers, desperate foreigners, masses of the huddled and hungry poor, gangsters and vagabonds, frontier brigands, Tswana kings, Boer rebels, historians and politicians, imperialists and socialists. And the setting is the land. I'm interested in how, particularly issues around, you point out desperate foreigners. I mean, how did that impact on your, as you were going through the country? Is that South Africa also is a very, it's changing all the time, and how does that, just also in terms of issues of xenophobia and also in migration. I mean, how did that impact on the stories that you heard wherever you were in the country?
This is a fascinating part of it, actually. I was driving somewhere on the highway just outside Johannesburg when I realized how big of a part of the story foreigners are. And it really comes down to, in very crude terms, overpopulation. So, for example, I didn't set out from Cape Town at the beginning of my research thinking at all I would have to deal with issues of xenophobia and the impact of our essentially borderless, or the state of our borders on the land question. But as soon as I got to Gauteng and I started checking out some of the land invasions, the most recent camps that have been set up, it's very often, and of course I haven't been to every squatter camp in the country, I haven't been to every land invasion in the country, but very often, and in my experience, many of these land grabs are as a result of spillover from already rickety extensions to formal townships. And very often it's populated by foreigners. You also have, for example, places like the inner city in Johannesburg that is, it's well known that there's a very large foreign presence and all of the troubles that come with that when the local persons react, and we have the xenophobic riots. I was actually caught up in one in Pretoria when that taxi violence that broke out. That was touch and go for a second. But it really is that simple. I think other historians have made this point before. Sorry, I say other historians. I mean historians. I'm not a historian. Historians like Louis Shanguan have made this point that it sounds so simple, And that's why people are maybe a bit wary of it, but really we might just have too many people in the country to provide housing for everyone. And that's definitely strengthened by the fact that when I was up at the border at the Bait Bridge, that we basically have no border security. It really is that bad. You know, you drive up there and there are just signs all along the road that say, warning, do not stop, high crime zone, at intervals of every 500 meters. You know, it's Wild West country up there. So, yeah, I mean, it sounds a bit crude to say it like that, but really, it's the evidence is there. If you go look around the land invasions and the places where shacks are being set up, very, very often, you hear Shangaan being spoken. And when I say Shangaan, I mean the Mozambique version of Shangaan. So,
yeah, fascinating. And so there was one part, I mean, it goes, you know, Znin, KZN, and can you talk a little bit about the traditional, your interactions or your stories about chiefs owning tracts of land, for example, in KZN. I mean, there's a lot of controversy about that at the moment, and how you square the kind of constitutional rights together with traditional rights. And it seems to me as if there's a somewhat intractable situation with regard to that sort of with regard to that traditional setup. Talk to us a little bit about that, your experiences with regard to that on your road trip in KZN and elsewhere.
I have to say KZN, I spent more time in Durban than anywhere else. A lot of that chapter comes from the research of other people's. I think where I personally experienced that situation was more close to Zeerust in the Stads of the Bauruche, which is a Tswana group. And I think, you know, it's extensively laid out in the book, and I don't think we have time to go into it now. But essentially, in a nutshell, the Stads around Zeerust, places like Lehuruchi and Dinokana, and these massive towns that are essentially owned because they, when the National Party took over, they had the system of holding land in trust for indigenous groups. Who obviously couldn't own land under the discriminatory laws back then. And so in order to kind of stabilize and control that situation, they register the land in the name of the minister, and it would be administered on behalf of the state by what they called chiefs, but which very often were actually just people who kind of were from a prominent family and were sympathetic to the government because they knew they could take advantage of the situation. In any case, these Stads of the Bauruche are kind of the legacy of that, because they're these large tracts of land that still belong to essentially one person. And the government, in operating to provide services to the people who lives in these areas, works through the chiefs. And I think that's very well set out in one of the chapters where I wrote out a long verbatim dialogue that I had with a farmer and one of his Bauruche workers. When she essentially was under the impression that the chief is the one who builds, for example, subsidized housing, or the chief is the one who is in charge of the water and electricity supply. And she was fully under the impression that that's how it works. And actually the chief is just kind of the middle guy, or the middleman between the people and government. And yeah, it's strange, you know, because I understand that we have this ideal of a pluralistic legal system where we operate with this kind of more Western style ideas of what governance should be. And then also we have a constitutionally mandated duty to try and accept and also adapt indigenous law to that kind of system. But that's not really what I feel is happening. It's just kind of evolving into two systems, just like it was under apartheid. There's no real what's the right word? Synergy between the two, despite you know, a lot of academic writing on the subject, which of course it's very difficult. Add to that fact that we have a incredibly, horrifyingly corrupt and incompetent government. You can't see it happening anytime soon. But that was my experience.
So I want to bring you, I mean, that takes me nicely to this idea of, you know, these two parallel systems, because in the example of what's happening in Orange Farm, and the person at the end, I think it says, the conclusion is it's the same as what it was in apartheid. And at the end, I think quite ominously, the individual goes, violence is coming. If you don't give, we take. And I thought that those were very powerful words, but also the fact that almost the more things change, the more they stay the same. So, I mean, maybe just some comment on that exchange with the person in Orange Farm, which I thought was fascinating. Yeah.
So that individual is Brix Mokolo. He's an activist from Orange Farm, and he's been around since the very beginning of Orange Farm, which is in the late 80s. And I mean, so as I put it in the book, Orange Farm is really, it's forced town planning. It was never intended to be a town there. The official townships for that area were laid out. Orange Farm was started by persons who went and put up shacks there. They came from surrounding areas and also from eastern Soweto. And eventually, purely by sheer stubbornness, refusing to leave, making constant demands of first the Transvaal provincial administration and then the ANC government after 94, they've now become a formalized township. I mean, it's amazing to drive the streets there because you can almost still see the underlying pattern of how it was just random shacks laid out because people needed a place to build a house, and then how the formal development is intertwined with that and surrounding it. And they have this huge mall now, and they have clinics, but in between that is still these pockets of absolute poverty and desperation. And it's mind-blowing. It's the kind you'd only see it in South Africa, really, where it's like a shanty town and a formalized town mixed into one, crisscrossed. But to get back to your question, Brix Mokolo has been there throughout all of this. So he's kind of first he fought for services from the National Party government, then he fought for services from the ANC government. And his conclusion is kind of that he hasn't, he's still not satisfied. And he uses the word equalize. In his opinion, the persons who live in Orange Farm, they still need to equalize with the white suburbs. And for them, until that kind of situation happens, he's going to carry on fighting. And the quote you make reference to is actually, it's literally on a sign on his office door. So he pointed to it and said, that's our motto. If you don't give, we take. And I mean, to his mind, and he's absolutely got the moral high ground. He's a very socialist orientated man. He believes that if government isn't providing what they are legally mandated to provide, then why not take it? So that feeds into that broader question of, there's also a beautiful quote that my fixer, Pule, gives in one of the chapters, I think also around Orange Farm, where he says that these land grabs, they can sometimes be good and sometimes be bad. And I get that, because the kind of common idea we have of land grabs is that they are somehow evil or orchestrated or kind of aimed at taking back from whites, right? And that's kind of that's what happened in Zimbabwe. We had army vets literally going to a farm and putting off the occupants. Here, the land grabs are kind of, it comes from that culture that started under apartheid of protest and withholding your labor and ensuring that services are delivered. And that's kind of just carried on. I think people don't realize how old this practice of grabbing land to force government to provide housing actually is. Soweto is to a large extent the result of that kind of behavior under James Sofasonke and Panza. That's quite literally how it started. Again, in the book, in chapter 18, so Davidson started. So, sorry, long answer to your question. The point is that's what Brix means when he says, you don't give, we take. And to him, it's completely justifiable.
Yes. And that's, it takes me also to the next part of the conversation, but I'm just, for clarity's sake, Peter Mansfield has put in the chat, what is a fixer? It's somebody, I mean, as somebody who goes ahead to set up interviews and to set up your trip, in a sense, point you in the right direction. I mean, that's as I take it. Yes.
Yeah, it's a local oak who knows people and he can put you in touch with people, and he gets paid for his time. And often they get paid extremely well, because there's no way, for example, I'd have been able to speak to a person who was actively grabbing land across Orange Farm. without a fixer.
Yeah.
That simply wouldn't have happened. And
Yeah.
there's a really interesting story about what happened there, but I'll leave that for the book. I can't give all of it. I do want people to buy it.
Exactly. So Carl, now to go to, I mean, we've talked about Orange Farm, and I want to go to the three pillars of, land reform in South Africa. You talk about redistribution, restitution, and tenure security. I want you to talk a little bit about what's gone wrong, because clearly things have gone wrong, and why. And secondly, is that, I mean, the restitution is more kind of the citizen-led stuff, and then tenure security. I don't think we talk about that enough in South Africa. So perhaps just a few some thoughts on what went wrong, how and why, where are the major issues, and also how. We can talk about moving forward, but I'll leave it there for now. Because it seems like we had a perfect plan for land reform, right? That this was all going to work very nicely, but things went awry. And here we are in 2020, and we're still having these sort of what seems to me as fundamental conversations. We haven't really moved out of the starting blocks in a way. So your comment on that?
It certainly feels like that. I agree with you 100%. I wouldn't say it was a perfect plan back in 97, but certainly the more I thought about it, because that's obviously the first thing I did, is, you go look at what is the legislation underpinning this whole reform attempt. And so you go through it and you think, all right, well, now I understand that. And then I left Cape Town and I went to go speak to people and I did more research. And the more I did that, the more I realized this is maybe the initial idea for reform is maybe the only way we could have really done it in an orderly, cogent fashion. And that was quite stunning for me to realize. And then you think, okay, but if it was a good plan, like you said, why then are we still having the same conversation we were having in 97? And really, I've been asked this question before by other journalists, and I still don't have a very good answer. At least I don't have an answer that takes less than 10 seconds to set out. Basically, it comes down to incompetence and corruption, especially with restitution claims. Wow, it's just a minefield. Some of these restitution claims take up to 2 decades to resolve. And the legal team for the claimants is very often sponsored by the state, so it's taxpayer money. Over the course of 20 years, we've now finally had judges who are starting to order punitive cost orders against the lawyers who drive these cases when they know it's a hopeless case, that the persons aren't a community or that their dispossession occurred prior to the cutoff date of 1913 or whatever the case may be. You also have, we've also seen these kind of almost brokers pop up who kind of know how the system works, how the game works, and then they'll go to a community and say, listen, we reckon you've been dispossessed. Let us help you lodge this claim with your local restitution board or get it gazetted. And if whoever is on the land now has any problems, we'll fund your legal case also. And I don't have any proof of this, obviously. It just seems to be kind of rumors around certain spheres, but that these brokers are acting unscrupulously. I say brokers, but it's generally NGOs and those kind of people who perhaps might be acting very much in the sense that they feel what they are doing is right. But at the end of the day, we have persons sitting on these boards who have to process the claims and gazette them, who are very often not trained historians. In fact, I'd say the majority of the time. And who are kind of paper pushers. They're also very under-resourced. They have this entire structure of government that is tasked with processing these claims. So you have a person who is maybe one person sitting in an office. He gets this claim that's for thousands of hectares of land with multiple narratives surrounding the history of it. And that one person has to now make a call on whether this is a valid plan. Very often they do that, and it's completely wrong. It goes to court. Then the parties have their experts. It turns into this huge fight. The media gets involved generally, and it takes 2 decades. And at the end of the day, nobody really comes away with anything. So that's what I mean when I say that restitution and that leg of land reform, it was supposed to be wrapped up. There was period that you would communities were supposed to come forward, lodge a claim, it would be gazetted, sorted out, and we'd be done with it. And that's been extended ever since '97, and it's still ongoing. And that purely is just due to incompetence. It really is. I can't provide another explanation for it.
And then also, I mean, there are some egregious forms of corruption, for example, often involving the ministers themselves. If you think of Gugu and Quinty and Mala Mala and various examples. So, that doesn't really help us. And just a couple of comments. Yeah, a couple of comments on tenure security. And then I just want to bring in Tamsin Hudson has said a fourth leg was added to land reform, namely land administration. I don't know if you've got a comment on that as well, Carl, at this point.
I'd have to ask him to expand a bit on what he means by that. I'm not completely sure.
It's a her. Yeah, Tamsin, you're in the chat, so if you want to explain about land administration, I can ask the question. But just while we're doing that, security of tenure, as I said, I don't think we talk enough about that in South Africa. Your comments on that in your journey of the year.
I'm sorry, I was reading the chat and I completely lost sight of the conversation.
No, it's fine.
I'm so
Carl.
sorry about that. Yeah.
No, it's no problem. I was just asking you about tenure security. We've talked a lot, just a little bit more on your impressions. Yeah.
There are certainly a lot of academics who feel that tenure security should be first and foremost on the land reform agenda. And that is basically because you have millions upon millions of people who live with insecure tenure. Now, what do we mean when we say that? It basically means that you have farm workers, for example, that I think that's the chief example, or the other big example is persons who live on land that is owned by a chief, also the traditional authority structures kind of things. And so these are people who live on a plot or in a home who consider that their home. It's theirs. They've lived there for generations. Their father lived there. Their grandfather lived there. They plan on their family living there. But they don't legally and technically own that home or that piece of land or that plot. And millions of people sit with this because this is the result of the fact that Black people couldn't own land for so many decades. That, of course, didn't stop anyone from moving. Farmers still needed labor, or chiefs still wanted their subjects, or however it works. It's not like, I think the misconception is that because Black people don't own a lot of land, they occupy a tiny part of the country. That's clearly not true for anyone who just drives through the country. The point is that they don't have formal, proper title and therefore enforceable rights to the homes in which they live. So this makes it a very easy example for a landowner to evict persons that have lived on their land for generations. So the legislation that was introduced to try and address that issue is the ESTA Act, the Extension of Security of Tenure. And that's a part of land tenure. And I think that's why a lot of people are pushing for this to be the most, because instead of giving people land that ends up as horribly in some instances as we've seen it happen, is that the land that people already reside on, to make sure that they have rights to that land that they can enforce. And for example, if you own a piece of land, you can take out a loan on it, use the land as security, or you can sell it to get a huge jump in capital, or whatever. The point is you have options, as opposed to living on a big farm estate that you and your family have worked for generations, but you don't actually own that house. That is tenure security. And I must say, in my personal capacity, I quite agree with the arguments a lot of these people are making. But the thing is now, the past 2 minutes we've been speaking about it, it's not nearly as exciting or emotional as speaking about farm murders or land grabs or whatever. So that's why it tends to get lost. It's just not a glamorous or a sexy topic. The most sensible things never are, So,
exactly. And so Carl, that's a good segue, because we have got a question from Colleen Dardigan about land reform. How is land reform feeding into the farm murder narrative? But in any event, I want to, to talk about that because, your conclusions around farm murders are quite nuanced. And so perhaps you'd like to unpack those and now, before we talk about I do want to get to kind of the populism and land, but perhaps just on farm murders. And there's been a recent a revival of the narrative around farm murders and around genocide, and Cyril Ramaphosa's presidential letter with regard to that, which I thought was, level-headed, but there's a lot of, it's obviously very emotive. So just some thoughts from you on that, also in the writing of the book.
I have to say, Judith, it's very early in my career for me to ruin it, man, by saying,
yes.
by saying something
I'll
that
try
might
to stop you from doing that. Yes.
Look, I'm Afrikaans, right? I have a lot of friends that are farmers. I have a lot of family friends. I'm very much emotionally affected by this phenomenon. And I 100% think it should be considered a priority crime. And there's this undercurrent of kind of dismissiveness about farm murders and farm attacks that I find a bit crude and off-putting. At the same time, I don't think there's any kind of ulterior, kind of overarching plot to drive whites off the land. You'll see in the book I write about when that was actually, in actual fact, the case during the reign of Appla and the NK landmine campaign of the late 80s and early 90s, but certainly not anymore. It's strange. I left Cape Town having a certain viewpoint on farm murders, and every single time, because I went out of my way, since it was still such a big part of the research, I went out of my way to speak to victims of farm attacks and so on. And I have to say, 90% of the time, the farm attack was as a result of some kind of syndicate operating to rob, for example, a farm store where they had large amounts of cash due to the trading, or another thing that often happens is where a farm manager will withdraw a large amount of cash to pay the salaries for the workers for the month. And some information will get leaked and they'll be attacked that night with the attackers knowing that there's this large amount of cash. Of course, that doesn't account for how horrifically brutal some of these attacks are, and especially also the torture that often takes place, which I kind of was skeptic about. And then as I spoke to some people who had been tortured, for example, this didn't actually make it into the final version of the book, but I went to the court hearings of one of the accused in the 12 vessels case, which I don't know if you recall, but it was then Bonnie Bell, and he and his wife had been tortured with boiling water and etc. And so it's certainly, that brutality aspect of it is certainly real. But I also have to say that groups like AfriForum recently have really, I'm not sure if toned down is the correct word, but I don't think they are the ones pushing the white genocide narrative so much. That I get the sense that's more fringe elements lately. AfriForum has kind of gone out of its way to bring also black farmers and emerging farmers under their mantle of protection. So I think the kind of narrative has more become one about protecting our rural communities, well, for some people anyway. I think I veered off the topic a bit here. What was the actual question?
No, that's fine. Well, I just wanted your thoughts on it, because and that's perfectly fine, because the question of how the farm murder narrative does play out. I just, I mean, there are a couple of questions on the chat. Just to go back, so I don't know if you're done with that, because I think that it's such a complex issue, and as you've said, the narrative about genocide. So then I want to come to before we go to the chat, the question around the land and populism. And so you talk about Malema and Nkitama, who are not the sort of true face of South Africa's land crisis. And you talk about border control and all of that. And to me, it's always seemed as if land is a proxy in South Africa it's an emotive proxy for many other issues. So all the socioeconomic rights that, haven't been fulfilled. And so land is something emotive to hang your hat onto. So maybe just some comments from you on that, and how you see the land crisis playing out, and also, where did the solutions lie? Because there have to be some solutions. And then I am looking at another comment in the chat from Willie Hofmeyer, and he says the stealing of land reform farms is a big issue. In 2013-14, the Asset Forfeiture Unit in SIU recovered about R500 million worth of farms on the request of Minister Nkwinti, but he was removed from his position and the investigations were stopped. So perhaps a thought on that, but I'd be interested in your, the first part of that question, which is about
is land a proxy?
Yeah.
I think when I first started doing the research, that was one of the biggest dichotomies of the whole issue, is when people demand return the land, are they talking about return our chance of having equal economic opportunities since the whites arrived, or are they actually talking about a specific piece of land that is sacred and holy to them? You have that very famous Frans Fanon quote about the land which will bring them their bread or something, or I can't remember the exact quote, but it's everywhere in kind of radical leftist discourse. It's just a fundamental anti-colonial creed. And so that was never quite clear to me, and I tried to keep as much of an open mind as possible. I tended to favor this idea of land being a proxy, as you say, for just general inequality. But of course, because that's what a responsible journalist does, is you look at all the options. And I actually had an amazing conversation with the author Botlale Tema about this. She wrote that book, The Land of My Ancestors. Yeah. Again, something that didn't make it to the final book. And I had to speak to my friend Alice, who is the editor.
Cut so much of this. Tell us about that. What didn't make it to the final book?
Well, basically, she was of the opinion of that second perspective, that the land debate is actually about very specific pieces of land that are sacred to a family or a community or a group. So what I'm trying to say is that actually, because you can read her book on it. She wrote this very, very good book, The Land of My Ancestors. The funny thing about that is, though, that there was another Tswana group who played a role in the dispossession of her family around the Pilanesberg, under that prize scheme that I was talking about of the minister holding things in trust. And long story, but anyway, so yeah, the point is I tried to justify that viewpoint of land being land, specifically that it has ancient value, that it has sacred value, that it is all the emotion about it is justified somehow. And by the end of the almost 18 months that I spent researching this thing, I just couldn't justifiably make that conclusion. I think somebody who's really put this argument forward exceptionally well is R.W. Johnson, that curmudgeonly analyst. He's I find him to be a bit abrasive. He doesn't really take people's feelings into account when he writes, but whatever. I agree with him on this point, and especially now after this 18 months, land seems to be really a more general sense of frustration at the fact that there's still this massive disparity between the economic fortunes of white and other minority groups and the majority black population. So land is seen as this kind of the fountain of all inequality in South Africa. I suppose there's a big argument to be made about that, and there's a big debate to have. But I have to say, in my opinion, when you look at the fact that land invasions are 95% of the time about demanding services in the form of housing delivery. When you think about, I once heard this conversation on the radio where a couple of radio presenters were talking, and a black man, one of the presenters, who's quite famous actually, I won't mention his name, but he was saying, listen, he doesn't want a specific piece of land. He can't trace where his great-grandfather was when he was dispossessed or whatever. He just wants a piece of land that he can build a house on and rent it out. And that to me kind of summarized it, really. It's about economic opportunity. So I think at heart, people like Julius van Leeuwen know that. But it's much harder to sell when you have to, like I just did, spend 5 minutes explaining your position. And again, like I said at the beginning, because inequality in the country is so patent and it's so obvious to everyone, why bother faffing about? I mean, obviously, I think you should bother, I'm just
Yes.
speaking
Yes.
hypothetically.
The populist answer to that would be, we'll just take the land. But that's interesting, and it takes us to the debate around expropriation without compensation. Somebody's asked a question regarding that and saying, don't forget to talk about it. So your thoughts and comments on that. And then somebody else has also asked, how do we get hold of all the stuff that didn't make it to the book? So yeah, if there's anything burning that you want to tell us, Carl, that didn't get into the book, now's the chance.
There's so much. I mean, I hope Alice is listening to this so she can see. There's demand. No, but seriously, the only way we can do that is if this book sells well enough that Penguin gives me a shot at doing a follow-up.
Yes.
Alice? Yeah, otherwise, otherwise, I mean, the problem is that the market now is so depressed. We already, I was actually having a few drinks with my mates yesterday before I went to go do an interview on CakeNet. And I asked them, so what did you think of the book? And they kind of just looked down. And I said, you haven't bought it, have you? And, you know, they both are journalists. They work in the media. I would excuse my friends who haven't written a book since, read a book since high school. But these are journalists who are interested in these kind of things. And I asked them and they said, look, money's tight and books are expensive. And that's very true. We are going through an extreme economic downturn. I don't really blame people for not buying books right now. I can't afford it.
Your book is not as expensive as Barack Obama's Promised Land. So.
Oh, hell no.
but yeah, expropriation without compensation. And then we've got a couple more questions in the chat. What are your thoughts on that, on the land debate and, you know, constructive, not constructive, necessary, unnecessary?
No, I'm very much against the idea of EWC. I fall pretty much in the kind of the Institute of Race Relations camp when it comes to this specific point. I believe property rights are the cornerstone of the civilization. And I know a lot of people disagree with me on that point, and that's fine, but you've asked me for my opinion, and that's my opinion. I think EWC would be disastrous. I think it would be a nightmare. But the way it looks like it's going to end up, it's just actually going to be a bureaucratic nightmare rather than a kind of Zimbabwe scenario. Because if you look at the terms of the expropriation bill that's been promulgated now, is a very kind of defined set of circumstances under which compensation can be nil. Although people like Gabriel Kraus at the IRR have argued that actually those terms are incredibly vague and open for abuse. But regardless, the fact of the matter is it's all gone through the proper channels, you know, and eventually courts will become the arbiter of these kind of disputes. So you can imagine farmers identified as being in the public interest, and the owner argues that he's using it for something, or he's planning on keeping it for its value increasing, and the state will say, aha, but that's exactly one of the situations in which we can now expropriate and offer you no compensation. That dispute of fact is going to go to court. As we know, our court systems are clogged up. It's going to take years to resolve. So at the end of the day, if it passes in its current form and looks like the trajectory it's going towards, I mean, we still have the Constitution, Section 25 hasn't been amended yet. So that gives even more ammo to those persons who would dispute the granting or the attempted giving of nil compensation. The point being, it's not going to be a Zimbabwe-style kind of thing where you literally have army vets showing up on your farm and driving you off. But it is going to be extremely difficult to kind of, it's just going to tie up a lot of resources. It's going to cause a lot of frustration. And it's definitely not a silver bullet in its current form for the kind of communist uprising vibes that the EFF wanted to be, you know. So, yeah, I don't know. We'll have to see how it plays out. Yeah. I'm not an expert, you know.
Yeah. Okay, so just on this, we've got David McKemmer, who's asked, from 2001, we are battling to get our land back. Makongwani and Northwest officials are causing fights in the community, which have stopped functioning. Where can we go for help?
Soya Harman. Go to Soya Harman. In the Northwest, there's a boer outside Zeerust, whose name is Soya Harman. He's very involved with emerging black farmers, and he vehemently hates the CPA method of doing land restitution. And, you know, he might have a point there, because expecting a group of 100 people to farm for one common purpose is perhaps like putting cats in a bag and expecting them not to fight. And yeah, Soy's around Sierras. Look him up. Look up his website. He's the only guy I can think of for direct help.
Okay. And then there's a question from Carmen Anderson saying, is it true that national government have instructed provinces to put a stop to housing projects due to lack of funding? I'm not sure. And then Willie Hofmeier's comment is, the big issue about expropriation without compensation is a bit of a red herring. Ultimately, the jurisdiction of the courts to decide whether the compensation is fair in terms of the Constitution. And I think that, yeah, but there's a public education issue there. And then just another question from Jackie Pollock. Shack farming has become a phenomenon, building several hundred shacks to rent out. Could you comment on how prevalent this is in informal settlements?
Okay, so as regards the first question, I have no idea about that. I'm sorry, I can't confirm or deny that. I think it's pretty plausible that we're running out of money, considering our national debt is getting close to our total GDP. So, but yeah, I cannot confirm or deny. Willie Hofmeier said something about the jurisdiction of the courts eventually.
Yes, so Willie's point is about the expropriation without compensation. It's a bit of a red herring, because at the end of the day, the court still has to, the jurisdiction of the courts ultimately to decide whether the compensation is fair in terms of the Constitution.
Yeah. So I think, that's a bit of a, that's the same point I was making. And I think what Willie says is absolutely true. But the further point to make there is how long that's going to take, how acrimonious it's going to be, how much money it's going to cost, and what is it eventually going to bring South Afrikaners in his sak. I assume Hofmeier is up.
Yeah, what is going to benefit? What will it benefit us?
Yeah. There you go.
Yeah. And so I just the one of the points I want. Yes.
Sorry, the third question. I didn't answer that. The prevalence of shack farming is staggering. It's ridiculous. It is. I obviously knew, everyone, all South Africans know that shack farming is a reality, and I mean, on a certain level, it's just business. But the scale of it that I experienced in every single township I went to, from the more formalized townships right down to the squatter camps to the places like Blikkiesdorp in the Western Cape, it is a huge market. I mean, there's literally a hustle culture around it. You'll have often I heard accusations that foreigners get involved as well. In Davidton, my fixer told me that the foreign oaks come over and they find Nyaupe addicts to go fill in the forms and apply for subsidized housing, and just give them some Nyaupe as compensation. When those forms come in, they occupy the subsidized housing and rent it out. And because there's such a lack of oversight and absolute incompetence when it comes to these issues, there's no real way of determining who is in that house or who is legally allowed to be there. And it just becomes part of the kind of quasi hustle culture, really. I think if you genuinely want to know more, there's a lot of it in the book. But just to answer your question shortly, it's huge. The scale is huge, in my experience.
So we don't have much time left, Carl, because this has gone quite quickly. But just a brief comment on the writing in the book about here in Cape Town and the Philippi horticultural area. I mean, my interest in it is, the food security aspects and also the way in which we develop land. But your book also has a different take around the descendants on the land and so on. So maybe just a little bit of a taster on that, so that people really will go and buy the book.
Well, we definitely don't have enough time to do it justice, but like you said, it's there. Basically, I think it's maybe the area, one of the areas in the book I covered that has the most stakeholders and the most diverse group of stakeholders also. Apart from the racial aspects of it, because obviously in the Cape you have not only is it a white versus black kind of dichotomy, but you also have the involvement of brown people, which is a whole other tamaleki. But the point is, so you have the different racial groups there. Then you have the farmers that have been farming there for 150 years. You had the urban squatter camps and townships expanding up to their edges over the years. The traditional farming systems broke down along with that. And now you have developers who want to develop there in order to, well, this is their stated aims, is to address poverty. Obviously, it's also to turn a profit by building, for example, a shopping mall that could provide job opportunities, etc. But this proposed development has now been opposed by environmental groups, because the Philippi horticultural area is also very special in that it's based on what is called an aquifer, which is a source of unevaporable water, which is quite unique. And it's why those German descendant farmers can make such a good go of it, even though it looks like the flats. You know, it's sandy, it's useless soil. And also there's a lot of silica sand that is mined. So mining companies have an interest there because it's very rich in silica, you know, it's used to make glass. Yeah. So it's just the amount of persons that have an interest in this little patch in the flats is huge. Yeah. And I don't touch on all of it in the book, but you can certainly, certainly provides a jumping off point. Yeah.
That's perfect, Carl. So unfortunately, I mean, we're going to have to leave it there. It is a fascinating book. It is beautifully written. It is available at the Daily Maverick shop, and you'll see the link to that in the chat as well. I think I want to just close off because one of my favorite quotes about the land is Saul Plaatje's his native life in South Africa, and he says, awakening on Friday morning, June 20th, 1913, the South African native found himself not actually a slave, but a pariah in the land of his birth. And he goes on to say, mine is but a sincere narrative of a melancholy situation in which, with all its shortcomings, I've endeavored to describe the difficulties of South African natives under a very strange law, so as most readily to be understood by the sympathetic reader. And I suppose that takes us right back to 1913 and a beautiful way of describing the symbolism and the emotion around land, which I think we can never ignore. And so, Carl, you've written sensitively about this. And so thank you very much for this. And I'd also like to thank the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung today for supporting the Daily Maverick, for supporting this kind of webinar and this very important debate about land. And I do see that Alice Ings has written in the chat, and she said she can't speak for Penguin, but she hopes that there will be a second book because Carl is an exceptional writer and this storytelling is very important. So I think on that note, we can let you go, Carl, with an assignment to maybe start writing another book, even without their consent. So thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much to all of you who've joined us for your comments in the chat. We didn't have time to get through all the complex questions, but let's keep reading and do go and buy Carl's book, which I'm going to hold up like this. So thank you very much, everyone. Take good care. Bye.